Pro-Israel bias among the British media has long frustrated Palestinians. But when people complain to the BBC or to newspaper editors, they are often met with defiance or simply ignored.
You do have to acknowledge the barbarity, the brutality of the attack on Israelis in southern Israel by Hamas before this can move forwards.
Oh, God. I mean, I can't believe I'm hearing the same thing over and over again.
But Declassified has finally been able to break through that wall of silence and speak to journalists working inside the national media who are also concerned about the way their outlets are covering Gaza. I'm joined now by our reporter, Hamza Yusuf, who's written an exclusive investigation for Declassified, exposing what's really going on inside TV studios and newsrooms. Hamza, thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
So Hamza, how did you get started on doing this investigation? What made you think that there was a real story here?
So having been keeping up with the media for the last 15, 16 months throughout the genocide, I'd also posted a lot of clips online, whether it's headlines, whether it's interviews, whether it's news reports, and seen the clear patterns of systemic bias. And journalists had reached out informally and said, thanks for raising this, or even themselves sent over some stuff and been like, look, this is the coverage at our news channel. So we spoke to The Guardian, Times, ITN, in the broadcasts, Sky News and the BBC, and so it was across the spectrum and not just, for example, right wing or left wing. It was across the board they're engaging in the same patterns of systemic bias.
Of course, and we're here now outside the BBC, which has been the focus, quite rightly, of a lot of criticism of the coverage of Gaza. Can you tell us about what people who worked at the BBC, current and former staff, told you about the coverage from inside?
Well, one thing that stood out was the suppression of the word genocide.
This is a genocide happening in front of our eyes.
We have, that word is, as you know, incredibly emotive, and the Israelis, as you know, will be saying that they are targeting Hamas.
I don't want to go down the avenue around genocide. We know that.
And I think that speaks of a culture at the BBC where they like to teeter on the edges. They like to instill or implement this level of impartiality that they think they have. One journalist spoke to me and said they pitched a story centering Palestinians and was immediately told, well, we need to now find an equivalent centering the Israelis. So in other words, playing it as this two sides, two narratives, rather than looking at it from the prism of Israel committing a genocide in Gaza. Other journalists at the BBC talked of the dehumanising attitudes that exist within the newsrooms from staff and from above. So in November 2023, when the journalist was watching the footage coming in out of the siege of Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza, and was horrified by these war crimes being committed, and made the comment that, I can't believe Israel is allowed to get away with this, to which their BBC colleague sat next to them retorted and said, I can't believe Hamas uses Palestinians as human shield. And these are the people writing reports, these are the people doing the research and producing. So I think it speaks of a wider culture of pro-Israeli bias at the BBC.
The people you spoke to at Sky News, it's a really interesting example because Sky, lots of people watch Sky Sports, it's just seen as quite a commercial channel perhaps. But when it comes to Israel-Palestine, it seemed like you were detecting a real kind of bias and kind of editorial structures that journalists were running up against.
Yeah, what was revealing was, speaking to Sky News journalists, they said, producers, researchers, staff, journalists would be sitting watching the raw footage come in and effectively being muzzled, suppressed, not being able to describe it in those categorical and vivid terms. So the footage is there in front of you, whether it's a school being bombed, whether it's a hospital, decimation and annihilation of Gaza, and yet not being able to report in that sense because of the constraints that exist.
And how would that manifest itself? Let's say if there's an Israeli guest or a Palestinian guest, what kind of treatment would they get and what would be the response as well to that coverage?
From behind the scenes, a Sky News journalist revealed that if Palestinian guests were treated a particular way or weren't aggressively grilled in that way, or even just humanised and the Palestinian perspective centred, then the words of the journalist at Sky News was that there would be an avalanche of phone calls afterwards. So that speaks to a level of pressure behind the scenes, it speaks to a level of lobbying behind the scenes, and ultimately reveals that there is a pressure that comes from above at Sky News, and that obviously plays and filters down to every level at the newsroom.
Your channel refers to Palestinians as prisoners, even the children arrested without trial, and the Israelis as hostages, is again racialized othering of Palestinians that has allowed the genocide to happen for 15 months.
What stood out from the journalists at Sky News was that they said, we don't wait for the Russian version when they're obliterating Ukraine. We take Ukrainian statements at face value, we center their perspectives, and yet there was a deliberate and conscious choice not to do that with the Palestinians.
We've just heard from the Israeli Defense Force, who've revealed their interim findings on what happened the night that 7 aid workers were killed in Gaza. They said a case of false identity and a series of grave mistakes led to the deaths of the workers.
And so, were they very trusting of Israeli government narratives? Is that something that they were almost told to, that's the narrative that you need to prioritise in the coverage?
Yeah. So Sky News journalists revealed that the Israeli narrative reigned supreme, and they push back against this. They'd go to senior staff, they speak to editors, and they say, why are we not able to report this in the same way? And also, why are we still trusting the Israeli sources, having after we've known that they've lied historically? But there was none of that. It wasn't, there was no adding of context. There was a complete detaching of context and reality, and effectively making sure that one narrative remains, and that's the Israeli narrative.
And of course, on the Israeli side, they've done protests outside the BBC, accusing the BBC of bias for not referring to Hamas automatically as a terrorist group, just as an armed group. And there was this documentary that the BBC brought out last week about surviving in Gaza that they then pulled because a boy narrating it, his father had been a deputy agricultural minister in Gaza, and they claimed this was a terrorist leader's son who narrated the film. What did you make of how quickly the BBC caved in to pressure there from the Israel lobby? Did that surprise you?
Actually, I think it crystallised what we revealed just days earlier, where we journalists that we spoke to said there was a pressure, there was a particular, as I said, a suppression of the word genocide, and a kind of a focus on centering Israeli perspectives and ensuring there's no negative coverage of Israel. And that's obviously the case. I mean, this was the first time in maybe 15, 16 months through that documentary that the BBC humanised the Palestinians to a degree, and it was immediately taken down. So I think that was actually revealing and actually reinforced what we'd found out from journalists at the BBC.
We've spoken so far about TV broadcasters, but let's turn now to print media. You didn't actually go and speak to tabloid journalists. You focused on the broadsheets, which people might expect higher standards of. What did you find at the Times, a newspaper owned by Murdoch and his family for decades now? What's it like being a journalist there?
Well, the Times is the UK's newspaper of record, which is supposed to set the benchmark and set the standard. And there were a journalist at the Times who said they were crying in the bathroom. Such was the barrier they were up against in trying to humanise Palestinians in their coverage. They mentioned the fact that, when they'd mentioned since October 2023, it would then be changed in the editorials and by editors to since the Hamas attacks. So just these linguistic tools to ensure that there was a particular narrative that reigned supreme over at the Times. And they mentioned, the challenges they felt and the emotional toll it took. And the particular journalist I spoke to wanted to be dispatched to the Middle East, having previously done stories not just on Palestine but in the region, and was actually said, no, you can't go because of budgetary constraints. And then a journalist who is more pro-Israel, if you like, and had previously covered Ukraine, they were sent over. And it then was revealed that they went to the IDF briefings and they did all the right things, if you like, in terms of ensuring there was a particular coverage and a particular narrative over at the Times. So that, I think, was revealing about the type of culture at the Times and within the Rupert Murdoch establishment.
Hamza, I think one of the most surprising things that you found in your investigation is actually what's going on inside The Guardian, which positions itself as a progressive, liberal title. Some people might still think that it could have some of the more balanced coverage of Israel-Palestine, but in fact you found that that's far from the case.
Yeah, the journalists that we spoke to at The Guardian firstly pointed to a really comprehensive spreadsheet which they've logged and documented instances of The Guardian's bias, whether it's misreporting, whether it's centering Israeli narratives, whether it's not challenging Israeli spokespeople. And what was interesting is that they said they come up against a stubborn leadership and management who were refusing to, if you like, learn the lessons or at least take on board some of the criticisms from staff internally. What was interesting is the journalist then mentioned the deceit by omission strategy by The Guardian, which is to effectively thin out information. So they wouldn't mention the testimonies of Israeli soldiers or what Israeli officials said immediately after October 7th about their intent in Gaza. That wouldn't be included. They'd usually use words like flee or leave in regards to the evacuations, or they'd mention the evacuations without clarifying that is violation of international law. So all of these aspects which the journalist said which paint a comprehensive picture about Israel's crimes, which were deliberately, according to them, thinned out by The Guardian. And what was interesting is they said, well, you look at the words like ethnic cleansing or phrases like genocides, and you look at a newspaper in Israel like Haaretz, a liberal Zionist newspaper, which effectively suffers from censorship as well in Israel, and yet it's able to consistently use the words ethnic cleansing in its coverage, and yet The Guardian can't. So as they said, in their words, this is a newspaper that is supposed to be the bastion of journalism. It's supposed to be independent, progressive, and to set the standard, but it's ultimately not doing that. And to which they concluded that we all know the foreign desk of The Guardian follows a British establishment line anyway. And I think that was revealing. It's something that almost an illusion has been shattered, because a lot of people still, as you said, do trust The Guardian and see it as setting the standard, the gold standard of journalism.
So Hamza, as a Palestinian who's grown up in the UK, you've obviously seen, 2009, 2014, and now 2023. Israel has repeatedly launched these onslaughts on Gaza. But this time, do you feel the media coverage has been particularly blatantly biased?
Yeah, there's always been, whether it's speaking with family, friends, listening to the news, there's always been kind of an understanding that the media is pro-Israel. There is a systemic bias there, and we're not going to get a fair hearing. But I think that's definitely been crystallised in the last 15, 16 months since October 2023, where it's just way more obvious. It's that they're not even trying to hide it anymore. The aggressive grilling of Palestinian guests, the particular framing, and even, to be honest, just not reporting on certain things. There were countless war crimes Israel is committing and just haven't been covered. And I think that's crystallised and reinforced a lot of perspectives that Palestinians have within the UK who have grown up here and kept up with the media.
And for the journalists that you spoke to inside the mainstream media, were these obstacles that they'd come up against earlier on in their career, or was this a kind of completely new experience for them?
I think a lot of them had an idea about the barriers in place at these institutions, but what a few of them didn't know is that this kind of reinforced, I guess, the broken nature of the media system, and they're working from within to try and alter that, if you like, and make sure that there are stories that centre Palestinians, perspectives of Palestinians are heard, and they do their best to ensure that they can raise issues with their management. But what they have said is that their experience, or like what they viewed the media as prior to October the 7th in relation to coverage of Palestine, has been consolidated, and that's not the UK media, the mainstream media, is not going to humanise Palestinians. It's not going to cover Palestinians in the right way that maybe other broadcasters do internationally.
Hamza, I think you're absolutely right. The Gaza genocide has completely exposed the failures of the mainstream media, and it highlights why outlets like Declassified, doing true independent journalism, are so important, because you won't find stories like this anywhere else. If people want to support the work you're doing, they can subscribe to Declassified from £3 a month. They can help share this video, subscribe to the channel, or make a donation through the super thanks. Hamza, thanks for talking to me today.